Simon.
Hey, Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hey, Simon.
What's up, Simon?
How you doing?
Hello. Hey, Simon. It's Skylar. How you doing?
Hello, Simon. Hello.
Hey.
Hey there.
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
This is Conversations with Storytellers, a podcast of wisdom, thoughts, and folk and fairy tales from our community, and I am your host, Simon Brooks. This is a meeting with professional storytellers. I know there are many places to be, and I'm so glad that you're here. Ben Haggerty is one of the premier storytellers from the UK, one of the founders of the London-based Crick Crack Club. He has run and created festivals and was a major force in helping the UK storytelling renaissance. He has mentored many storytellers and even written a graphic novel. He brought Duncan Williamson, Scottish traveller storyteller, to English audiences and further abroad. I don't want to spoil what we get into, but we went deep into the craft. Please welcome Ben Haggerty. Ben Haggerty, I am very excited to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining Conversations with Storytellers.
Well, thank you, Simon. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope you'll ask me some good questions and we'll find together some interesting answers.
I hope so too. So, Ben, I've known of your work for a long time, and it's really, really varied. And so what I want to do is a question that I usually ask everybody on Conversations with Storytellers is, were there storytellers in your family when you were growing up as a kid? And who were they, and what kind of stories did they tell?
Absolutely, straight away, the whole reason that I tell stories is because of my father. My father was Glaswegian and born into the most difficult and challenging circumstances. He was illegitimate, let's put it like that. He was fostered into the only Catholic family in a Protestant tenement. And in his life, he said to me towards the end, "Like, poverty, Ben, don't talk to me about poverty. I've got a degree in poverty." He was a communist. He led a strike age 16. He worked in the docks. He walked age 17 onto a boat and was up and down in the merchant service in the South Atlantic before the war. And then in the war, he was unable to, they wouldn't take people who'd been at sea into the Navy. So he went into the RAF and he was cack-handed. And he ended up with what some people would call a good war, in that he never really saw much conflict and was involved with air sea rescue and messing about in boats around the coasts of Britain and Ireland. But he was the most spectacular raconteur and storyteller of his own life. He was quite fabulous. Fortune struck in that during the war, his foster parents died, and he decided he would leave Glasgow. He came to London. He killed his Glaswegian accent. He was quite a good actor. He was very handsome. And he managed to get a job at the British Council, which moved him into an entirely different social class. And he was one of I've worked with the British Council. He was one of these young people who take a visiting artist or a visiting guest around. And for example, he took Haile Selassie to the Royal Opera House.
Oh.
That's quite a story to imagine, let alone hear him tell. And by chance, he was always interested in narrative and story. He got himself into the film industry. And he made documentary films, a few adverts, never moved into television. He was just of the generation that was, the 60s came and, cut them at the legs. So everything he aspired to is everything that the 60s was against. So he became a writer, a playwright. He wrote novels, none of which were terribly successful. And my agony was that he was such a fantastic storyteller and he was not a great writer. So my ambivalence towards the pen is very invested in a trick that I felt my father missed. So but he would hold forth, and he managed to live to 96, and he kept his marbles right to the end, and he died a very great death. He was in hospital for a minor operation, but I think he relaxed, and he died in the middle of a sandwich. He didn't know he died.
He died in the middle of a sandwich.
Yeah, he just found dead with a
No
sandwich in
way.
his hand, which is a great way to go. And
Yeah.
but he moved himself across his life, from utter poverty. His foster parents took in kids for money to raise them, sleeping three or four in bed. He got lucky in the sense that he married my mother, who was a doctor, so he was able to marry into a middle class family, and change the station that way. But
Wow.
he was a spectacular storyteller, and he was somebody who did things, and he was very idealistic, romantically communist. By the end of his life, he was perhaps swinging in the opposite direction, but that happened to a lot of people, I think.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's fascinating. I mean, I think that parents my parents' generation, right, who grew up at the very end of World War II, the stories that they tell. And for that generation, that next generation up, I mean, the experiences that they had and the way that the world changed was, I look at my grandfather, right? He was born in 1902, saw the invention of flight, saw the motor
Exactly.
car, saw computers coming in, even though they were the computers that were the size of a room, but he still saw them in, right?
Yeah.
And the change in the way that the world, socially and economically, and all those changes that happened in the world were incredible.
I mean, one of the great things about my life, because I'm a storyteller, but I've also organized a hell of a lot of events to
Right, yeah.
put on the map. And so for a long time, my father lived in London, so that was a bed, and we were able to bring artists home to stay there. So hearing Duncan Williamson and my father in conversation was the most fantastic thing.
Oh my gosh.
A bottle of whiskey, and my dad's accent slipped and slipped and slipped further and further into raw Glaswegian as the bottle went down. It was quite fantastic.
Alcohol can do that, right?
Yeah.
So I've got another question for you. I don't really know the answer to this. Did you found the Crick Crack Club?
Yes, I did.
All right, that's what I thought.
Just to go back to the influence of storytellers, though, because
Yes.
the other person was my mother.
Okay.
She was not a storyteller. She was the granddaughter of a bookseller, or rather, she was the daughter of a bookseller. So my job, Saturday morning job, in the 60s as a small boy, was unpacking children's literature. And so I got to read Ursula Le Guin before anybody else, for instance. There was a verse, because we had them before release date. And I never really progressed onto adult novels. And in the 60s, there was a particular publisher, Paul Hamlin. And Paul Hamlin's genius was that he was a socialist, and he used the East European printing presses, and his idea was to produce art books, and he would publish books, four color plates, and then the black plate would be in different languages. So he was able to mass produce cheap collections of books about art, and he had a passion for mythology and fairy tales. And so the whole of Europe in the 60s was had available to them these beautiful collections of French folk tales, Russian fairy tales, whatever, illustrated by East European artists, but put into English and the other Western languages. And so I was saturated in East European folk art as a child, and I think my imagination still very much goes to those picture books, and to also the East European fairy tale films, which were part of the sort of East-West détente situation. Sort of children's stuff was considered okay. And so things like famously The Singing Ringing Tree, but there were many other tales from Europe. shown on TV in black and white, and
Right, yeah.
a crummy English voice sort of telling the story, but in the background there would be German or Russian or Polish or some of the other Slovenian languages
I was just thinking Czech, yeah.
yeah. Um, and so the fairy tale language of this just soaked in, all that sort of stuff soaked in to create a rich sort of sponge that liked fairy tale.
That's awesome. Wow. Yeah, I remember those Paul Hamlin books. I remember those. I don't know if I don't think I still got any because, when I came over here, a lot of my stuff was
Yeah.
sent to charity shops that because my mum didn't want to keep it all.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember those Paul Hamlin books. I didn't realize that was why, they did that four color thing with the black and different light. That's genius.
It is genius, and he made the Paul Hamlin Foundation is one of the biggest arts sponsors that there is in the UK, and it's all based on just spotting that you could change the plate.
Yeah. Yeah,
The Crick
so
Crack Club,
yeah, Crick Crack Club. So how did you get into that? Was that the first, or was this something that happened over time and grew out of something else?
No, the Crick Crack Club was formed towards the end of 1987,
Okay.
and very specific history. I began telling stories as a storyteller, in quotes, self-consciously as a storyteller, trying to earn my living as a storyteller in 1981. So I must have been about 22, 23 years old. And I was lucky, and I will constantly say we, because the opportunity to become a storyteller is that I had been working in community theatre, and we were working in a Black Youth Centre in West London, in Acton. And in the theatre company was the very extraordinary, at that time, 19-year-old Godfrey Duncan Toop. And he was in the same company as I. And with another woman called Daisy Keeble, we set up this storytelling group as a sort of sideline to the theatre company. And Britain had just undergone extraordinary riots in 1981 in Brixton, Croxteth, Toxteth, all over the country.
Yeah.
And they were riots about the police. I can't bear this American phrase, race riots. They were just the youth against the police because the police were abominable.
Yeah, I remember those riots. Yeah.
But at that time, the community theatre group that I was in was doing a show in Southall in West London, which is a sort of an area that in those days then was sort of, some of those schools were 98% Punjabi children. But I saw a teacher walking by with a big blackboard under her arm, it was a whiteboard with words on it, which were about gentle Jesus, meek and mild, something, something, holy child. And they were still doing Christian assemblies to a non-Christian audience. The whole idea of multicultural education had not awoken. And but those riots sort of brought into sharp focus that society was changing, particularly in the city areas were changing, and that education needed to change accordingly. So we set up the little thing called the West London Storytelling Unit, which the aim was to tell stories from all over the world to children from all over the world. And nobody at that point that we knew of was doing anything like that. So if I occasionally say we, I'm referring to the fact that I've always worked with colleagues, and who those colleagues are have shifted over time, but I've never been on my own. So I don't like to take any sort of credit as a pioneer, as an individual. I've always had, everything that I've come to has been through discussion with others.
Right. You've built a community around you and created things.
I have a
with
huge
community
around me,
Yeah.
and some people very close community, really professional community and lifelong community at 40 and more years of it now.
That's awesome.
So we started this storytelling unit going into schools, telling kids from all over the world, stories from all over the world. And immediately we were working 3 or 4 days a week, every week, So
Wow.
we'd spend a whole day in a school, and initially we'd start off as a group of three doing, 4 1-hour sessions. But eventually we realized that if we each split up, the three of us could get to 12 different classes. And so we were doing 12 hours between us a day.
That's
So
crazy.
in terms of flying time, which is what I think you need for learning to become a professional storyteller or somebody who is doing something that's a bit more than one can do casually,
Yeah.
is you need the famous 10,000 hours that the Beatles had in Hamburg. Well, we had it
Right.
for 5 years and more actually. In the 80s in schools, not only in London because we were rapidly going up to Bradford and over into Essex and all over the country,
Wow, that's
um,
awesome.
doing hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of storytelling and having to create and find hours and hours of repertoire. Because if we're doing that much work, you need the stories, you chew them through. So it was a very accelerated learning process. And the reason I'm telling you this is that we had this intense experience of working with children as an audience, but we kept in researching stories, and in fact, our passion for stories, we kept finding things that were too adult. And
Yeah.
so we then started a little club in about 1982. We called it the Club Night. And at that time in London, there was a big thing of performance poetry had come
Right.
up.
Yes.
And following, uh, I mean, this whole idea of poetry having to be a written thing was under huge challenge, of course, by the almighty Lyndon Kwesi Johnson, and then Benjamin Zephaniah and others came from the
Yeah.
Caribbean background, but also from other sides. There was something about the sort of a vernacular demographic being able suddenly to perform poetry in regional dialect, and it didn't have to be written down; it could be rhythmical. And so, for instance, Toop and I went with Daisy went to see Michael Smith and Oku Okonora performing in a pub room in Acton, and still to this day is one of the burning impressions of orality. This is orality. This is physical. This is sound. This is volume. This is passion, and it can only really be caught in the room live. And
Yeah.
this sort of excitement around live performance and all the riskiness of it, because also at that time I was deeply into reggae music and the sound systems. There was a thing called toasting, which then America got involved and it became rapping. But toasting was improvised and freeform, and so again, with my sort of anti-script, anti-pen thing, my whole school of storytelling has been, you know the story very well, but it's the way you tell it is created for the audience then and there. Of course, if you tell a story 1,000 times, it tends to fall into a sort of a pattern, but that pattern has been evolved interactively. And so it has this physicality to its shape, and there's a point to repetition, there's a point to alliteration, there's a point to call and response. So we started telling stories also to adults, and also we went and discovered that there were other storytellers around. And by 1985, I took a risk and went to an enlightened arts centre director, the Battersea Arts Centre, which is a major experimental arts centre in London. Went to her name was Jude Kelly and said, "Could I run a storytelling festival here?" And she said, "As long as it doesn't cost me anything, yes." And I was 20, 25, 26. It's unheard of that somebody would give a young whippersnapper the whole venue, the run of the whole thing for a week, 7 days we had. So
That's
we
awesome. Oh my
organized
God.
the first storytelling festival in Britain, a public storytelling festival, and I had set up a guarantee against loss with the GLC. And in fact,
That's
so many
the
people came that I was so honest with my accounting that we weren't able to call down the grant. So it ran itself. None of us who organised it got paid, but all the artists got paid from the box office. It was there's a helicopter going over, I'm afraid. But uh,
the GLC for our American listeners is the Greater London Council. Is that right?
yes, run in
Yeah,
those days by an enlightened individual called Ken Livingston. Look him up,
that's
and
right. Yeah, no, I know Ken Livingston.
he,
Yeah,
he was
interesting fella.
He was a fantastically provocative fella and very
Yeah.
performative, and he enraged Mrs. Thatcher, which was great. Um, so we did that festival, and so I brought Duncan Williamson down to London, into England for the very first time. For instance, and we brought from France Abby Patrick's, and it was a major event. People were driving down. We got a good piece on the Radio 4 about it as advance publicity, and people were driving. Off on holidays, and they literally, one woman came up to us and said, "I was driving down the M4 and I just pulled on at the next junction and turned the car around and came back." And
No way.
yeah, we hadn't anticipated it selling out. The whole thing just sold out. And the barman was very happy. It was the first, because we were allowing people to take drinks into intervals, which, was, again, in those days, it was not very allowed, but because there was a sort of folk element to what we were doing, that was the ethos of the folk club, is that you could drink and listen to a story. So he said he took the biggest bar take he'd ever taken up until the point in that festival. So he wanted another one to come back. But on the back of that, we got another festival at a brand new art centre in West London, which sadly is about to close, I think, called the Waterman's Art Centre. And there we ran, so in 1987, the second UK International Storytelling Festival, we called it. And we got Joe Bruchac over there and Kevin Locke, and Diane Wilkstein came to do Inanna, and I think of all the building-based festivals, it was the most successful one we ever did. And on the back of that, I then got invited to do a 2-week-long festival at the South Bank Centre.
Wow.
So that is the equivalent, I guess. I don't know what it would be in New York, but something like the Lincoln Center. I mean, it was the main National Arts Center in London.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that was 1989. So I would have been by then approaching 30. And not only was it 2 weeks there, but there was a tour to 12 different cities around the UK, and I spent 2 years organising it. Didn't get paid. I got 2,000 quid for the 2 years' work. That's not.
Oh, we
But
did.
in terms of prestige, it was, and I took that cash. I owed rent to Camden Council. I literally took the cash out of the bank and straight into the rent.
Wow.
But we needed it for prestige, and it was an amazing festival. My hair went grey and began to fall out, and there were some very stressful things happened in it. But we were able, for instance, to bring Louise Bennett over. She was living at that time in Canada, but it was the last time Miss Lou came to the UK. We brought Eamon Kelly the last time he performed. He's an Irish
Oh,
storyteller.
yeah, I know Eamon, yeah.
We had lined up Robert Bly to give a lecture, but in fact, the South Bank wouldn't pay an American fee in those days for him. But we got. We had two ashiks come from Eastern Turkey. We had two wonderful Inuit throat singers come from the Hudson Bay.
Wow.
And I'd lined up it was the first time I was trying to get these Panvani, which is my obsession. It's an epic singing tradition from central India. Some Panvani performers over, but there was a cock up the first time, and said that word. There was difficulty with, you can edit that. There was difficulty with the visas, and that's all to do with the challenges of the caste system in India, and people over there feeling that folk performers should not be traveling out of the country. It should be classical.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow, that's bizarre.
it happened again and again and again. It was really very interesting. This tension between, sort of folk artists and classical artists.
Wow. Huh.
Professional folk performers. It's not amateur professional folk performers, but they have just a very low status. But it was a magnificent festival, and the international program was fairly easy to put together. Jay O'Callaghan came from America. Vi Hilbert, the wonderful Vi Hilbert came. Laura Sims came. But the UK component was not so obvious, because we had met some folk storytellers. We now were linked in with Duncan Williamson. Betsy White sadly had died, the Stewart family, and a few of the Scots Travellers. We also had Robin Williamson coming from the sort of folk area, and one or two others. But in terms of sort of performance storytellers and people who didn't have a folk tradition but had a more theatrical background and were performing for strangers, is a semantic difference between performance storytelling and folk storytelling, but it's quite important. The UK team was not very strong in that most of people's experience was working for children and families, and this was going to be possible for adults. So I set up towards the end of 1987 this thing called the Crick Crack Club, and the aim was to give an opportunity for talent that we had recognized, but to give them the experience of working with adults and to see if they could do it. So the Crick Crack Club to this day, it's still going very, very strong, has been there to bring on talent, to push and shape public performance storytelling. That's the storytelling, not in a storytelling club to a known audience, but always to strangers. That's the huge difference. Have you got the skill set that you can work with people who are, and particularly in London, people who are seeing, top stand-up comedy, top theatre, all sorts of things, and you've got to stand on a par with that. It's not. It's about a skill set. And so the Crick Crack Club began as a weekly thing in a pub room, in a pub theatre in Ladbroke Grove, and then it moved and wandered all over London. And over the years, we had some astonishing luck, really, in that because of that festival in 1989 at the South Bank Centre, we then had 10 years in a wonderful space called the Voice Box, which was a 90-seater. Spoken word space, dedicated spoken word space, and 4 or 5 times a year access to the Purcell room, which is a 350-seater. So we had 10 years at the South Bank Centre, followed by 10 years at the Barbican Centre, followed by
another nice venue.
12 years at the Soho Theatre, running monthly clubs. And so, we've had to work with a kind of, in a way, a fairly small group of storytellers who've got the repertoire, the stage presence, and the ambition to hold an audience of strangers on their own for 2 hours. That's the paradigm. Now that's a huge skill set, and many storytellers. So one of the things that I've, the way you can tell that there's been the presence of Ben Haggerty, is this encouragement for people to tell stories that are at least 1 hour long, single stories, long narratives. So for myself, my repertoire on short stories is they're good stories, but I don't have very many because I'm used to telling stories that are an hour or 2 hours or even 2.5 hours long.
Wow.
And so there's a whole world of sort of festival performance storytellers who can do 15 minutes, great. But the 1 hour single narrative, suddenly, whoa, there's not so many people who can do that.
I don't know how many people over here can do that, to be honest.
No, because the economies are also very different, and I'm being really obsessed by storytelling. I'm interested in Jungian approaches to things and Freudian approaches to things and structuralist approaches to things, and structuralism, very crudely put, looks at the factors which will cause something to be as it is, and so applying sort of amateur structuralist sort of observation to how the storytelling revival in France or in Germany or in the US or in Canada or in Scotland or in England or in Wales or in Ireland or anywhere has happened. There are huge forces at work which are completely different from one country to another, and therefore they shape the way the storytelling evolves and yes, the storytelling styles and the strengths and the weaknesses. So in France, for instance, where they had for very many years a wonderful system in their social security arrangement of the intermittent work permit, it was called, you would get government funding. You could be unemployed and be an artist. So if you were a painter, you could spend 50 weeks of the year painting pictures and receive this government funding. And then for the 2 weeks of your exhibition, you sign off and then you take the money of what you sell. And so many of the French storytellers were able to develop huge technical skills, working with percussionists and voice and song. But they had this form of subsidy sitting at the heart of the system that allowed them to spend time. Whereas, their comment to the English is that you're very punk. Not punk. Everything is very low tech, very rapidly put together. But it has a different effect. Both are effective, but in a different way.
Yeah. So I want to pedal backwards a little bit because I think that there's something really important, because there's something I've noticed as well over here. There are storytellers that have come from the theatre background, right? And then there are other storytellers like myself whose last theatre production was at high school, right? And we're like self-taught, right? We found this thing called storytelling, or it's found us, I think is more rightly. Storytelling has found us, and we found ourselves doing this as a craft. And so it sounds like in England, most of your folks come from a theatre, but is that right? Or is
For
that an
the Crick
assumption?
Crack Club, I think, I don't know now, it's a long time since we've done a survey, but I should think in Britain, and of course you being English understand the difference between Britain and England and,
Yes.
and Ireland and the whole politics around that. But we are 55 million English, 5.5 million Scots, 3.5 million Welsh. So England is a very specific dynamic. There's a lot of people here, and in the branch of the storytelling revival that I have been very closely involved with, the majority of the performers I work with have theatre somewhere in their background. Hugh Lupton is the main one who doesn't. He has teaching and interest in folk arts, and writing, which is why his language is so beautiful. But almost all the other performers I work with, I trained as a theatre director, not as an actor, but as a director. I get cross when people say that I'm an actor. I can't even remember the Lord's Prayer. I could never be an actor. I couldn't remember the lines. But quite a lot of us have, even just as set designers and things like that. We were not attracted to being on a stage, and so there's an immediate advantage there in that we're familiar with the sense that what happens when you walk on a stage, it is an extraordinary situation, and therefore you do need to know a little bit about how to make yourself heard, how gesture operates, how displacement on a stage operates. And there's a structural difference between it's a generalization, but it's an observation that I felt very deeply when I went to NAPS. I got an Arts Council grant in 1985, having done that first festival to visit NAPS, as it used to be called in Jonesborough. I went the famous year that Laura Sims was the artistic director, and it was, to my mind, the most fabulous festival. It inspired me. It had bowls from Bengal. It had somebody doing Beowulf in Old English. It had lots of left field radical stuff. It was really great. It had one performer used a cuss word, and half the audience got up and walked out.
Wow.
Apparently, it was a festival that was of great sensation. Famously the one in 1985. But I loved it and was very inspired. But what I noticed was the presence of the microphone, the handheld or the static microphone. And it's because in America, everything has to be big. Plus, you've always got this tradition of the congregation and the church and the preacher. We don't have the microphone in the church. And our economy, because we have state subsidy in the arts, we have many 150-seater, 200 theatre venues, and you don't need amplification, if you've got half a voice on you, to reach an audience that size. So it creates a very different performance style.
Yeah. Huh.
That's what, when I say about structuralism, it's just noticing what are the factors that are converging on this point to create this result, this consequence.
Yeah, so what you just said, like this penny dropped in my head. Sometimes they take a little while to drop, but it's like all the photos that I've seen of Crick Crack Club storytellers, and a lot of storytellers in the UK, so I never see them with a stand-up mic, with a handheld mic.
No. No,
Wow.
we do use them now. They've made
Headsets.
Headsets.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and the other consequence, of course, of that, and this I would say, now if you want to do really important stuff in an interview, is that if you do not have electrical support to your voice, you have to use physical energy, and therefore you begin to pump, and therefore the biochemistry of your performance is changing, and therefore you go into, I would say, occasionally altered states. Therefore, the flow, I don't know if people are aware of the concept of flow, but you go into a performative flow in which, particularly if you're an improvising artist, in which inspiration can arrive, can be channeled.
Yeah.
What I call mantic storytelling, and that's my particular thing, and that again is why I work with epic, and why we work with long stories, is that you can occasionally get to a situation. I think I wrote something a long time ago in one of the Jonesboro journals about performers in India, this epic singing tradition of telling the Mahabharata, which is a massively long and complex epic, where hallucination is part of the performance.
Yeah. That's yes. So, oh yes. I totally get that, because, when we have these things called olios over here, right? And you're given a 10-minute slot or 12-minute slot, whatever it is, right? And it's hard to, because by the time you're like halfway into the story, that's when like everything else like falls away, the self-consciousness falls away, and you become in the story. And then by the time you get to the end, it's like, oh, that was fun and short. And
this is the huge thing, is that the repertoire of traditional narrative, as you said right at the beginning, folktales, fairy tales, epics, and myths, it trips off the tongue.
Right.
If the structure and the scenario for telling stories is only 15-minute slots in folk clubs, there's only a certain repertoire that you can do. There are folk tales that are structured for that long, but any fairy tale is going to be compacted. Epic and myth is absolutely compacted, because, as Duncan said, why tell a story short if you can tell it long? The oral tradition is pre-technology. It's how to fill time, and so people haven't even touched the foothills of what is possible with traditional narrative if you don't have the opportunity to tell an hour-long story or even a 2-hour-long story. However, in order to have that opportunity, you have to create a structure in which there's an audience. So that's why I've spent, more of my life organizing things through the Crick Crack Club and through the festivals. Because after the South Bank Centre, I then went and I left that saying, I'm never going to do another festival in a building unless I'll do something in a field. And then I ended up running the Beyond the Border Festival with David Ambrose. And that was
right.
Creation. And that was in a jousting field. In 1993, we started that.
It was originally a jousting field?
Yeah, it's a whole castle with terrace gardens down to the sea. But it's no longer.
That's so cool. I mean,
it was cool,
what a place to do a storytelling
Yeah, it just sadly it all collapsed, and that's
Yeah,
um, but unless you can create a viable economy that works, you're not going to get into the real nitty-gritty of what storytelling offers. And so my passion has been East European fairy tales on the one hand, and they're long. A page and a half of Afanasyev, that's the Russian folktale collector, and there was all notes properly, with a pencil taken from, in quotes, peasants. Um, a page and a half of Afanasyev is an hour and a half of telling. They're massively complex stories, and they just expand the minute you start doing them and start the scenes come out, and they're huge. They unfurl like Japanese paper flowers. Um, or it's epic, and I've worked with Irish epic and epics from all over the world, and once you get into epic, they just go on and on and on because epic and episodic, the words are connected, and you do enter into if you're telling epic, I would define as stories about humans and gods, and if you're speaking about gods, then they're metaphorical embodiments of energy, and if you're telling a long story to 200 people without a PA,
yeah,
YouTube would always say the story spirits are at the window.
yeah, yeah. Papa Joe, who's a storyteller over here, I don't know where he got it from, but he calls it riding the elusive dragon, and I think that's a nice image. Like your unfolding of the Japanese flag. That was a beautiful analogy, and I think that is another.
Yeah, I mean, if it's mantic storytelling, it's not that you're on the back of the dragon comes into you.
Oh, okay, I see that. Yeah, yeah, and you can't do that with a 5 or 10 minute story.
Not really.
No.
Why the Crick Crack Club is unique is that by steadfastly, doggedly, and some people are angry. Why you never put us on? Because you're not working with the repertoire. You don't have the skills for. We've built an audience for a very particular repertoire, for a very particular thing, and we know what our audience is like, and we have a good audience.
Yeah.
But it's taken years and years and years to develop it, to develop the artists who have the skills to deliver what we need to be delivered. And it's fairly unique in Europe. And I think that this is where the whole personal story thing becomes it's just a different thing. And I don't engage with people because, as far as I can tell, in something like The Moth, the performers are not paid.
No, they're not.
So they're ordinary people getting some coaching to create a sort of a story that would normally be told at a dinner table through microphones to 1,500 people.
Right.
It's a very different aim, ambition, skill set, whatever you want to call it, economy. It's nothing to do with what we're doing. The requirements of the audience to go to a true life tales or personal thing is it's something about it. Reader's Digest, which has collapsed in the UK. I don't know if it still goes in America, but they used to have a thing called Life's Like That, and you're getting Life's Like That stories told to 500 people in a room, and it's an affirmation. It's a positive affirmation of our lives are okay, but it's nothing to do with evoking gods.
Yeah,
it's not a church. I'm using that word sort of metaphorically.
Yeah.
But the telling of wonder tales, the telling particularly of epics, is we are transforming the space into a sacred space, and it's not a story about how Aunt Rhodey's rooster killed the fox. I mean, that's a great story, and there's a time and a place for that, but it's not. It's different. It's just different.
Yeah. Well, it's making me think a lot about what I do. Recently, I was in Jonesboro, and they invite local schools to come to these shows, and it's just for the school. And I got, the organizer, they got in touch with the schools for me, and I was like, what do you want? What do you want? Because I don't want to just show up there and do like a bunch of folk and fairy tales if you're looking for something else, or if there's something that I have in my repertoire that I could share with you. And they asked for, it was Arthurian stories, medieval
Arthurian stories.
Yes, yeah. And so I was very excited about that. And because I asked soon enough, I was able to, I mean, I know these stories anyway because I grew up with them, right? But I've never told them over here. And so I sat down and dug in and told these stories. And it was a very, very different experience telling these stories to these high school kids than folk and fairy tales. And there's something that changes in your head. It's like those synapses. Mm-hmm. And you suddenly feel like one of them go click and it's moved over somewhere else. And I don't know, it is a different experience. Mm. And you saying this, I think that there is space for that over here in the States. And I think it's something important that we should do.
There's there is as far as I can see, there's a huge hunger for it. So, for example, and again, this is from the outside looking in, but this whole world of the Michael Mead, the Robert Bly, the men's movement thing, where they as I from the outside see it, that they've taken a slightly Jungian approach to epic and story. But they have large groups, not only of men and women, but not only men, but also women, listening to story in that way. And when I went to Jonesboro, the first time, there was a strong element of that there because this was the one that Laura Sims had directed. Right. The second time I went to Jonesboro, that was more or less absent. And I had a whole posse of people following me because I was one of the few tellers at the festival telling traditional tales. Because everything else was more or less was personal story or made up story, original tales.
Tall tales and stuff like that. Yeah. It's the same with me. I have people following. When I've been to Jonesboro and Timpanogos, people are following me around because it's folk and fairy tales and myths.
Yeah. So, and I think it's a different. I think one just needs to see that the two don't. Again, with the Crick Crack Club, we survey our audiences quite regularly, and there's no overlap. Our audiences want this; they don't want to hear personal stories. And when we've spoken to organisers of various sort of things, a bit like the Moth, but on a much smaller scale, their audiences don't want what we want.
Right.
It's not their cup of tea. They might like one or two stories like that, but it is a different audience, and you have to build your audiences, and audience building takes time and costs money. It is an investment there are investments that need to be made, but there is, I would say, hunger for this narrative. These stories at the Arts Council once. I was having to defend the case because there is such a bias, and it's a Protestant bias for original stories. We can all do it ourselves. We don't need mediators. We don't need artists. We can talk directly to God. We don't need priests. But this novelty all the time, it has to be new. It has to be original. We can copyright it. We can make money out of it. All sorts of stuff comes.
Yeah.
They were challenging, me and my small organization. But why don't you tell original stories? Why is it always this traditional stuff? Why don't you tell cutting edge stories? And I just turned around and said, our stories have got such a strong, sharp cutting edge that they can cut through time. Whereas most of the other stories, they're just blunt the day after they've been told. They'll be forgotten. And it is the case. What is there in traditional narratives? What is this mysterious thing that gets to people? And they want to retell it, and they want to retell it, and they want to retell it. It's not for everybody, but it's for enough people. It's just a question.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. It's one that I think we need to address. I really do. So I'd like to move on a little bit because I mean that stuff's really important. I'm really glad we talked about that. But I want to talk about a little bit more about you and your process. So first of all, how did you get into? Well, you didn't really address how you got into storytelling. You told us that there were storytellers in the family. You started this little club, this community in London. But how did that step from the theatre? What was that move to bring your foot over into the storytelling world? And then if you could tell us a little bit about your process as well, how you find the stories and all that kind of stuff.
I was never involved with theatre at school. I showed no interest in it at all. However, from the age of 13 or 14, I was being taken to the theatre, thanks to my father's interest in it. And I was very fortunate and saw, for instance, much of Peter Brook's early work, which was investigating all sorts of unusual repertoire and just exciting live energy, stuff happening in a room between people. And but I didn't see any of that in school. Though we had an extremely good English teacher who in the UK education system, if you get into the sixth form, you do an exam called A levels. And he said the English A level is actually quite easy. You can do it in 1 year, and we've got 2 years to do this. So we're just going to not touch it until the second year. Instead, we're going to do a global look at literature and theatre. And then he had us for the whole first year reading global plays and novels in a sort of step across 2 weeks, each of them. So we were reading Dostoevsky, we were looking at Jean Anouilh, we were looking at Japanese plays. He was an exceptional teacher. I was lucky, it was a private school, so you could afford to have 20 boys sitting in a circle. But so I was soaked in this idea of narrative. What is a good story? It doesn't matter where it comes from. And he would show us, for instance, Hindi versions of King Lear, and Japanese versions of Macbeth, and he'd show us films. He'd show us that the story is the main thing. So I think he plus my father awoke this love of stories. We read play parts in the circle, but I never acted in anything. But the minute I left school, I went on a mime course. I had seen Marcel Marceau and I had seen mime, and there was a lot of alternative street theatre, and I just thought I want to do that. I was a bit of a hippie when I left school. And so I did a mime course, and then I began to drift towards performance, and then I joined a wonderful, very political theatre group called Welfare State, it's in the name, who did massive street processions and things with fire and outdoor theatre. And I sort of realized I was being sucked into the performance world, but I was a maker. I was making masks and puppets, and for instance, we saw Bread and Puppet, the wonderful Peter Schumann's American group, came to London several times. I loved that sort of stuff. And I trained sort of as a theatre director and everything, but I suddenly realized that actually what I was interested in was the stories, and it was Diane Wolkstein's book. She had gone to Haiti and collected stories, The Magic Orange Tree.
Right.
Got given a review copy of it by P.L. Travers, actually, the Mary Poppins author who I knew. It wasn't so much the stories that got me, it was the descriptions of the storytellers. The book's beautifully written, and each story is preceded by an account of where she heard it. And so there's children, there's grandparents, everybody on the veranda telling stories. And I suddenly realized that rather than try and make fairy tales into plays, I should simply tell the stories. And it was the first time I'd sort of connection between what my father was doing and then applying it to a sort of a more formal narrative rather than a personal story. So the first story I told, in fact, was a story from The Magic Orange Tree in Portobello Road in 1978.
Nice.
On the street trying to busk in the summer. I banged a drum, and so many people turned around that I had a sort of out-of-body experience. I panicked, and my soul was up on the the roof looking down at this little puppet telling a story. I said, nothing to do with me. And I went back into theatre, and then it wasn't until 1981 and this situation following the riots and the realization that there was an opportunity to tell stories and we'd get some money, some sponsorship um, to send our group into the schools, that I then became a storyteller. And at that moment there, as you were saying, we had no teachers. But so we went to find other people, and for a while we couldn't find anybody. But then we did discover gradually that there were a small handful of storytellers in the UK, and we went and we spoke with them, and I think generally an older storyteller approached by a younger person sees that they can play a role because it is, it is about transmission, not only of the stories, but of the way of telling stories.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, my storytelling was absolutely transformed by Duncan Williamson. I met him in 1985. We brought him down for that festival, and then for the next 4 years, every Easter I went up there for a couple of weeks and just soaked myself in that Scottish fireside storytelling tradition.
Wow.
But then I met Panvani and discovered because my repertoire, I was interested in folk tales and his way of telling fairy tales, but that's a tradition designed for an audience of 30 people
Right,
in a
right.
long tent. So the performative aspect was a limit. It was very gestural, very textual, tonally, but there was no physical displacement. And putting Duncan on a large stage was not a good thing. And beyond the border, we had him running Kaylee's in the end for all sorts of reasons. But he was better in a small space. That was his comfort zone.
Right, right.
But then we encountered performative traditions from other parts of the world, where the things that destroyed our performative traditions had not these forces of industrialization and so on and so forth, which so decimated the English folk traditions, the movement. We're 2 generations ahead of the whole of the rest of the world through the big industrial revolution of the movement from rural society to urban society and urban,
Right.
in which storytelling couldn't really happen in quite the same way, which is why the Scots have a much better repertoire and the Irish have a better repertoire.
Right.
So when we did Beyond the Border, we very specifically there's this Mabinogion, which is a sort of jumble of story in Wales. Its status is not very clear as to who was writing it down and why, and whether it's not a case of slightly winding up the anthropologists.
Yes.
It's a very strange text. I don't want to offend anybody, but you can see the echoes of Irish stories in the Mabinogion. The Irish ones are much more complete, much fuller, and there's a jumble. And so, in order to tease that out a bit, when we did Beyond the Border, we wanted to bring people who were from India, from Turkey, from West Africa, who are working with stories of similar, this sort of Bronze Age, Iron Age technological phenomena that created stories which, all the problems we still suffer from are there in the epics of jealousy, passion, possession, theft. It's all there.
Yeah.
But we wanted to bring as many masters of those traditions as we could find to show people it doesn't have to be a sort of BBC recitation of a beautifully crafted piece of poetry. No, it needs to be a sound. The sound of epic telling is it's a sound. It's a cry. It's a metallic cutting knife that can cut across a market square or cut right back to the backside, the back seats in an amphitheater with 5,000 people in it.
Yeah.
It's and once you start to get that shouting energy into it, then the biochemistry starts to work, and then your visualization, and then the characters turn around in the story, and you find words coming out of your mouth that you didn't put there.
Yes.
It's so the story, having seen these performers, that gave us a permission in a way. That's how it needs to be done. With full on physical attack, loudness, whereas the whole folk tradition was so very still and quiet because it was being done in small, wet tents and
Yeah. Or pubs,
small,
right?
small pubs, yeah,
Or a living room, yeah.
and that's again this structuralist thing. That's it's like that because of these factors.
Right, right.
But you can change those factors and it'll become something else. And in the 21st century, we can change all manner of things because tradition and the content of these stories is not fossilized. It's not stuck. It has to adapt. It has to move. And
Yeah.
with the global migration of the world, every story now the ancestors are our common ancestors.
Yeah.
And the different religions, they're all speaking about the same thing. This is a global time. And I will stand here and say that there's a reason people are moving around the world. The world is jeopardized, and there's a reason the stories are moving around the world. And you could see it as a negative sort of emulsifying and a homogenization, or you could see it as a return to the riches that have been lost of the urgency of the ancestors.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming. Yeah, that's what I'm seeing now, is that there's a lot of this misappropriation of other people's cultures, and I stand I stand with that, and I see there's this necessity to share these because for all those things that you just said, we need to be telling these stories and the commonality of these stories,
Yeah.
because it shows everybody that, look, this story from here is saying the same thing as this story from here, right? So we share this commonality,
Yeah.
and we need to see that we're all the same, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think
we're all different, but we all share these same.
yeah.
We need to love each other. We need to look after the resources that we have at our hands, because if we don't, we're going to run out, right? We need to.
It's quantum. It is
Yeah.
possible there to be two things simultaneously.
Yes.
And I think we need to look at diversity and respect diversity. And there
Yeah.
are certain stories which are sacred stories, sacred to and have a very particular meaning to particular groups. And I think it's not necessary to touch those stories. But there are other stories, particularly, I had the good fortune for 11 years to work with Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Ensemble,
Oh, wow.
storyteller,
Yeah.
and telling stories in museums and before concerts. And as one part of the research, I put together a file with 30 different stories, the plots of which are more or less identical from Ireland to Japan or from Japan to Ireland via all manner of routes. Scandinavian versions, Russian versions, Siberian versions, Japanese versions, or English versions, French versions, Italian versions, North African versions, Somali versions, India, just to show that the imagination, because storytelling works by completion, the beholder's share, the listener, and that's the wonder of it, is completing and bringing all their experiences to make it. The story immediately jumps culture when you listen. I mean, my family's culture, your family's culture, nobody's going to see the same thing. And
Right.
over time, stories, the plots are similar, but the cladding, the scene setting, the scenery, the seasons, the flora, the fauna, they shift.
Yeah.
And so stories have always been moving with trade, with the slow migration of people, sometimes the fast migration of an invading army, or the Turkic peoples massively spreading, or you get a religion massively pushing repertoire. I mean,
Yeah.
the Islamic repertoire goes. The Hoja, Nasruddin Hoja, Mullah Nasruddin is Afanti in northern China. I mean, it's right across the world. So you can't necessarily pin stories down to a specific geography. And then there's a whole thing of attaching stories to place. The story is not born of the place; it's attached to the place. So that, I feel that there's a huge repertoires across the world of stories which are initiatory tales. They're stories for young men or stories for young women. And in many different parts of the world, the story will be attached to a tree standing on a little island in the fork in the river, and you've got a young man who needs to hear a certain thing, and you take them for a walk, and oh, you see that tree, do you know how it got there? And very casually, the tree is a sort of, it sparks the telling of a story about somebody who, I don't know, suicided themselves or something on that tree, or some tragic tale or something like that. But
Yeah.
and then you walk on, and people always know that that's the tree where this thing happened. But actually, you needed to tell that young man to get something into the air, to talk about something. Very casually, it didn't ever happen there, but the story has been attached to that place
Right.
as part of a book in the landscape, a book of values, a book of questions, a book of things. It's terribly rich, and I think we need to get much more. The world it's so urgent that the knowledge and experience and the love of the ancestors, which is put into these stories and is meant to be spread, is spread. Of course, if I get a booking on the phone for somebody who can tell stories from Africa, I will turn to somebody who has a much closer link to Africa than I do. But in a rural area, sometimes it's not financially possible, and Zoom is
Right.
no approximation for anything.
Right.
And I will tell a story from Africa there if there is no alternative. But
Right.
that's not an appropriation. It's better that it's understood that literature, that narrative literature is all over the world, and at the heart of it, we all have experienced joy and loss, betrayal, generosity, meanness. We've been victims, we've been triumphant, we've been cruel, we have regrets. That's the content of story, and it's the content of humanity, and it's everywhere.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is everywhere, and yeah, and that's why folk and fairy tales and myths and legends are so important.
It is, and but also the personal stories are important too, because
Yes, they are. Yeah.
that is that experience, but it's not clad in metaphor, and this
Right.
metaphoric language, this thing that uses the massively amplified imagination, stories from long ago and far away, paint themselves across your mind's eye and with a much greater vividness. That's why it's different. Whereas stories of today and the everyday, it's the imagination is there, but it's very minor engagement. Whereas
Yeah.
the minute you're having to imagine another time, another place, even if your imagination is based on crap that you've seen on Disney or film. Sorry, I
Yeah.
don't get in trouble with Disney, but you know what I mean.
Universe, I get it. I get
It
it.
doesn't matter. The imagination is yours, and it is vivified, and then it's beginning to work on the same circuitry as you're dreaming, and then the subconscious, and if you go with Jung, which I do quite a bit, that there's a collective unconscious or a collective recognition of human condition and commonality, then it begins to cut and make its mark and move and penetrate in a very different way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. Process. So, how do you find your stories, first of all?
In the beginning, it was books and other storytellers,
Uh-huh.
and there was a lot of sharing in the early days of repertoire.
Right?
And that's right, it should be so, particularly with folk tales. They are the stories of the folk, they belong to the folk.
Yeah.
Other stories, perhaps, as a more personal thing connected to that's so and so story, don't tell it, because it's their livelihood.
Right, right, yeah.
Within the UK, or within my realm of storytellers, there is a sort of, we're all thieves, but there's honor amongst thieves. Don't take somebody's work hook, line, and sinker. And so there's, these questions are tired and exhausted, but people keep asking them. We'll tell you what the source is. Go and do your own work on it. Or somebody might say, you can tell this version of that. It's my version of it. But so storytelling is a game, therefore it must have rules. Rule one is you have to tell a story you like.
Yes.
That's what I thought was the rule, but actually I ended up due to my work with Panvani and the Panvani form, I don't particularly like Greek mythology, but I ended up working with these stories, and so I like what they do. I don't like the stories, but I like how you can work and what you can say through them and everything.
Okay.
So even my own rule about going just with what one likes is
Bendable, flexible.
flexible. Yeah, based on experience, based
Yeah. Okay.
on why this story here now, why what is being said by the story, and what do I want to say? Because that, again, two things can coexist. There's what the story says, and then there's why I'm telling it. And you know, famously, we all know this pointing out of the triad from Armenia, that three apples fell from heaven, one for either storyteller, one for you who listened, and the third we take and we give to the princess or the king or the people who first found this story. But it marks out storyteller, and audience. And if stories are viral and wish to travel, then they're dependent upon a host, and therefore there must be something in it for the host. And so the host's job is to make the story infectious. And it's an unpleasant analogy, but since the internet has come, virality is a question now. But it's infectious, and part of that is there are things in it for you, and the story is happy to let you self-express some opinions or whatever. So there's the story, and then there's the storyteller's commentary, and the two travel together. And when you receive a story, you can drop the other storyteller's commentary and put some fresh commentary on it and send it on. The storytelling is not a verbatim. All this the story is not the words. The story is what happens. It's the plot. And because of the dominance of the three religions of the book and the sacred scriptures in other cultures as well, that we have this authority of the written word.
Yeah.
But even Mahabharata is written down, but it's very late text. The stories existed much earlier than that, and now in Ramayana, which is another huge epic in India, there are folk versions being discovered all over the place, and nobody now can, because we've come at it with this idea from a Judeo-Christian background that the text is the original, but the authority is no, it's much
verbal, it's narrative,
it's oral, and it's real.
And it's one of the things I've been thinking about lately as well is the whole literacy thing, right?
Yeah.
You're illiterate if you can't read or write. And if there's this general consideration that if you're illiterate,
but Duncan Williamson, he could read a little bit, he could write, but it wasn't his wont to read very much, and certainly not to write. But he was one of the most literate men I know.
Right.
It was quite phenomenal, and his awareness of language was astonishing. He said, "Ben, I speak 5 languages. I speak Highland Scots, Lowland Scots, English, Gaelic, and Traveller Cant." And depending on his audience, he would modify massively how he told stories in England, how he told stories in the south of Scotland, how he told stories up in the west. And once I was staying by him, and a traveller came to talk about something, and they spoke for an hour and a half in Cant. I couldn't understand a word of what was going on. They didn't want me to understand a word of it. But,
that's like the Welsh people when you go into a shop in Wales. They switch from English into Welsh if you're a foreigner.
But well, it's good to, and that is literacy. It's just the knowledge of reading the situation and finding the communications that's necessary in that situation.
Yeah. So how do you craft your story once you've got it?
So once I've decided to work on a story, it's for me. Some stories I've lived with for 20 years and still not told them. It really depends on what the story is. Some stories I do masses of research on them, or I just know that I'm going to tell it one day. It's not ready yet, but eventually I decide I'm going to go with this, and I do a certain amount of sorting it out with maybe a sort of a story map, or plotting it. I have various different ways of sort of just making sure that if the story is what happens, that I know rough enough of what happens to get going. Then I might take the story for a walk, which is what many of my colleagues do. We just walk and talk, and now that there's mobile phones, people just take it completely normal that there's a bloke walking down the road waving and gesticulating here, there, and everywhere. And the story begins to trickle out in that moment there. And then as soon as I can, I get it to audiences. Um, and when I had access to secondary schools, there's no money left in England, and the whole storytelling in schools is gone. It's tragic. It's absolutely awful. But I used to work in secondary schools a lot to work up my adult repertoire because if you can get particularly to sixth formers, they're pretty much adults and they've seen and
Yeah.
done everything you've ever done
And they'll be more honest than
already.
adults about it. You'll
Yeah,
see.
yeah, and exactly. There's no ego to flatter. They're either listening or they're not.
Right.
Um, and but I start to tell, and it's in the process of telling that the story then begins to reveal itself. And my stories get longer and longer and longer as I tell them, as more and more unveils itself. I've got a repertoire of maybe 400 or 500 stories, something like that, of which there's an absolute working repertoire of about 20, which I'm using.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
But there's a much bigger repertoire of stories that I have to call on, and I have notes, I have recordings, and I go back and get them. Um, my school's work has been replaced by museum's work, which is great because very often I'm having to tell a set of stories which I'm only going to tell once, but in the research for it, I find other stories. Um, uh, but my joy of the last 15 years has been that thanks to studying with Panvani, this tradition in central India, Panvani singers, and very particularly Ritu Verma, both in India and in Sweden. We kept failing to get her into the UK because of visa failures, and now she's banned. Um,
No way.
no, it's just the whole system is just. I'm banned from the US. I had a visa fail, and I can only get into the US if I have a sponsor, and somebody puts up the £1,000, $1,000 bail. Um,
We
it's
got to
it's
bail you out. We got to bail. We got to chip in and bail you out, mate.
it's just the way of the world. It's
Oh my gosh.
world is in movement, but people are well. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But uh, with Panvani, I have a group of my students and colleagues, and this is a means of telling episodes from epics called prasangs, which are sort of 15 to 20 minutes long. Um, but you're working with musicians, and there's this joker in the pack who's called the ragi, and it's somebody who you're telling the story to, but can ask you questions or support or agree all the way through, and so you can never tell it the same way twice. Because they'll suddenly say, "Why is that?" Or "Did she really say that?" And so you get into a dialogue, and it means that the story is constantly revealing itself. And so I've got a whole lot of particularly Greek material that started as Panvani 20-minute stories, and they're now 1 hour long solo pieces, or done with one musician rather than four musicians. Um, but that's the energy of even it remains a solo performance, but how other people can help you. It's taken us 15 years to crack it, but we've got it now. I've got a small team, and we really know how to work with this form,
Yeah.
and just cracks out. And so we tell stories from around the world that fall into the technology of the Bronze Age. And the early Iron Age, because and that technology leads to a relationship with agriculture, a creation of a pantheon that's regionally specific, but has extraordinary similarities in the roles that they're being asked to play, whether it's from Japan or India or Greece or Scandinavia or Ireland. You see
Okay.
that again, it's a structuralist thing. It's that this technology, this economy, this social arrangement is causing these sort of adventures to happen, or these are the concerns, and they're common. They look different, but you can recognize that it's the same. So you could just now, it's very clear that the car has completely wrecked the entire world. You travel wherever you go, it all looks the same because of the car. And we now have a common global culture. Of course, there's regional, specific difference and variation in the flora and the fauna, but the
Yeah.
sorts of stories that are coming up now are the same stories of agony and joy.
Yeah, right. Nothing's changed, right? I mean, it's, Sarah was my wife. She was reading Hamilton's biography or autobiography, whatever it was. And she's like, talking about the newspaper reports about him and everything that's going on. She says, nothing's changed. It's exactly the same what's going on today. Right. And so, of course, these folk tales and fairy tales and these myths and legends, whatever was happening on in the Bronze Age, even though we have all this technology around us now, we're still going, because we haven't learned from history, we're still.
No, but because they're not really about the outer world, they're about the inner world.
Right.
They're about the passions and the greeds and the desires, and the generosities and the loves and the joys that we're all carrying. And the external world is just a manifestation of it. But it's really the inner mystery that they're there, and that humans everywhere have experienced that.
Yeah.
That's the perennial. That's the commonality. It's from the inside. The inside is similar. The outside is very, very diverse.
Are there any words of wisdom that you'd like to share with our audience before we end this?
Well, I think that, if your audience is largely storytellers, I would look to see how they did it in the past and how let the stories teach you and look at the structures. For instance, this, the legacy of a storyteller lies not in a book or a film or a CD or a DVD or whatever. It lies in their student.
Yeah.
The one who carries on their work. And we were very, very lucky to meet these two remarkable Turkish ashiks. Ashik means a lover poet. They're epic singers of the sort of Turkish border with Azerbaijan. And everything about their tradition is very medieval, and of course, not everything that's old is good, and find all sorts of things to find problematic. But some elements I find very touching. So, for instance, the training of an ashik is 7 years long. They choose a student, and it's very disciplined. It's a tradition where they're playing an instrument called the saz, a stringed instrument, and they're singing with it. But it has huge improvisational aspects to it, and there's a big repertoire of stories to learn. It takes 7 years of very formal sort of sessions between the master and the student. And then at a certain moment, the student does something which is of a certain quality, and the teacher then kisses them on the back of their right shoulder. That's it. That's the end. They've achieved. The training is over. They can now go out into the world. The only payment for this up to 7 years investment is that the student brings a bolt of cloth to the teacher so the teacher can make for himself a new robe to form him.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
There's no money involved in that level of training. Money, and many storytellers earn them, I do myself, through doing workshops. But when you find somebody who suddenly you're really going to you're going to invest in, you're not going to take any money for that. So you really choose your student very carefully. And
Wow.
and I think that it's that humility that's needed. A lot of the charges of appropriation are around sort of imaginations that people are making money out of other people's cultures, and it's true, certainly in many respects. But I don't think anybody's making very much money out of storytelling when it remains oral.
Right.
But I think that this question of who is the student going to be? Or the one who wants to learn? You know, it's so important. It can't. There's a payment in there, but it's a payment that's not in terms of money. It's really in terms of commitment.
Yeah.
The currency of that payment is much more expensive than money.
Yeah.
And I think it would
Yeah.
help people take, in a way, certain things more seriously. If you took the money out of it at a certain level, this isn't about money.
Yeah. I got a question for you. This is a question I ask almost everybody. What is your favorite breakfast? Where would you have that favorite breakfast? And who would you have it with? Anyone living or dead?
My favorite breakfast, I think, would definitely involve toasted baguette, some olive oil, and some sliced tomatoes.
That sounds good.
And a nice coffee, probably in the south of France or somewhere in the Mediterranean or Spain. Who would I have it with? I have so many friends. I wouldn't want to.
That's a good answer. I like that answer. That's a good one. I like that answer. Well, Ben, I don't want to take up any more of your time. We've had a wonderful chat. It's been awesome. Thank you so much for joining with me with Conversations with Storytellers.
Well, thank you, Simon. I hope that some of that is okay.
Yeah, that's going to be all okay.
We didn't talk about Ben's other work like his graphic novel, but what an incredible conversation we had. Much, much food for thought. Thanks for being here. There are so many other places that you could be, and it means a lot that you're listening to this. To help me with this podcast, you can become a patron at Patreon by paying anything from $1 for an episode that you enjoyed or a regular monthly subscription. In return, you get extras, early releases, and other exclusive content of my work. www.patreon.com/Simon Brooks. It takes around 4 hours or more to make each episode, not including getting in touch with folks and setting it all up, and the marketing before and after. I don't have advertisers. You can also donate on my website, simonbrooksstoryteller.com. And yes, that's me, Diamond Scree, the English fella and storyteller. I'm also on Instagram, Simon M. Brooks. And I'm also on Substack. And you can join me there as well. A shout out to Chris Jed for creating and recording the music for me and my podcast. His band is called Blackpool Mecca. Once again, I hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to check out other episodes that you might have missed. Cheers!
It's just a story.